Well, excited to be here again. Not excited to say that I sat in my deer stand all week long. And I sat in my deer stand all week long. So, that's about the size of it. But, let me just say this to you. When there's not a lot of noise around you, it seems that you can hear God's voice clearer. I almost had a couple birds fly into the blind, scared me to death, you know. But I had a lot of time to think. I had a lot of time to think and enjoy and take pleasure in what God made and not be distracted, right, by problems. And in speaking of this series, Mindset, so many times our world is full of stuff, right? You're going to leave here. You may not even leave here, okay? You're going to get up after this service, and everything that you've been thinking about and or has been, worrying you or whatever will again take place in your mind, right? It just comes back. And sometimes we find it really, really hard to control and capture the thoughts. Like you're wondering, how can I get a hold of that thing because it's just tearing me up? I mean, I can't seem to get away from those thoughts. And so this series is based on that. Last week, we talked about anger. And so some of you, I'm not mad or upset, some of you were angry that I was talking about anger. You were. You told me. You were like, I was angry that you were talking about anger, and I wanted to get up and leave. And of course, I said, well, you may have an anger problem, right? And so, like, these are things that we struggle with, like our mindset, and the things that really press in on us every day over time, and we have a hard time sometimes getting a clear mind and taking those thoughts captive, because everything else is taking a priority. Today, I want to talk to you from one verse. And the reason that I did this is because many times, like if I use like 10 or 12 verses, the point gets cloudy, okay? And I don't want to be cloudy on this topic because it's important. And many of you either are experiencing this, have experienced this, or will experience this, and that is grief. Like how we deal with grief. What does our mind do? What does our body do? What are we supposed to do when we're dealing with grief? Now, it's hard at times when you're grieving, because many times you don't know what you're even thinking or feeling. So how do you take captive something that you don't even know what it is? You're like, I don't even know what I'm feeling. I'm kind of numb, and I don't even know what to say. The words escape you, right? And so hopefully we're going to talk about that a little, and I have a little special surprise for you today, which I think you will enjoy. But we're going to be looking at one verse, and this verse is really important as it relates to this topic because this verse is used a lot when people are going through grief, and it's in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. It's a very common verse, but I want to explain it to you. It may not be as common as you think. Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. If you have your Bible, your paper Bible, or your phone, or whatever it may be, you can turn there with me and I'll read it to us. Jesus said to the disciples, he was talking to disciples, and he said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Seems like an easy verse. Okay, I'll do that. Well, here's the thing with grief. Jesus can say that, and you can even know it, but when it comes to grief, there's like these hurdles that don't allow you to get there. I've been through grief. I've gone through grief. I still experience that sometimes. And so I want to talk to you about this, but first, let me give you the context, okay? And you might read this, some of you Bible scholars might read it and say, well, JP, that's not what the context is talking about. Great, I'm going to tell you what the context is so I don't get in trouble, right? The context is this. Jesus in Matthew chapter 4 actually did the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount was right after Jesus started his ministry. From Matthew chapter 4, 5, all the way through 10, 11, and 12, Jesus was healing people. The disciples were following him. He had Jews that were following him. And the problem was this. He had Jews that were following him that were grieving. And you have to ask yourself the question, why were they grieving? They were grieving because the religious leaders, and I use that in quotes, religious leaders heaped on them more laws to follow to try to be perfect. They knew they couldn't follow it, and they knew, because they were being told by their leaders, if you don't do this, God will not be pleased. Therefore, they all of a sudden had this heavy burden. There's something that we can't do, and so they were grieving over the fact that they weren't going to be able to please God. And so many times what happens, just like these Jews, where he says, come to me, he's talking about those that follow him, all of you who are weary and carry a heavy burden. This heavy burden that was put on them that they could do nothing about caused them grief and sorrow. And so many times, and this is true about grief, you didn't ask for it, you don't want it, and there's really nothing you can do to take it away at times. It was placed on you, just like those laws were placed on the Jews. And this word actually in the original means you're grieving because there's something that was placed on you that you can't really physically take off of you, so you have to deal with it. Grief is the same way. It's the same way. You can't just say, okay, I'm done with grief. It's over. And before I get started, I'm already started. Before I continue, let me just say this. And I'm going to say it as kind as I possibly can. The worst thing, if somebody's grieving and you have a friend that's grieving, or somebody's going through something, the worst thing that you can say to them is, don't worry, it'll pass. Don't ever say that. Let me tell you something about grief. Grief never passes. You just learn how to deal with it differently. That's what happens. God uses this stuff, and we're going to talk about that. But let me just request of you, if somebody's grieving around you, sometimes the best thing you can do and say is nothing. Nothing. Present. Be present. Look them in the eyes and give them a hug. I'm sorry. That's it. You can't fix it. If they can't fix it, you're certainly not going to be able to fix it. So let's be careful how we deal with people when they're in grief. Oh, don't worry about it. You'll get over it. You don't get over it. My dad passed away 11 years ago, August 31st. There are days when I still grieve. Sitting in my tree stand, thinking about my dad, grieving, missing him. Man, my dad taught me how to hunt. This is cool. I was telling my son that when we missed the deer that we were supposed to get and all. I won't go into that story anyway. Then we were grieving again. But what happens is, it's not that it passes and you get rid of it. It's that you learn how to deal with it differently, and as we're going to see, Jesus has a big part of that. He has a big part of that. So, how do we know that Jesus will help us? Isaiah chapter 53 tells us something, and it says this: He was despised and rejected. Listen. A man of sorrow, he was acquainted with the deepest griefs. Everything that you've experienced in your grief, he has experienced, and probably more. So when you're going through that, it's always good to talk to the expert, right? You talk to somebody who knows. Jesus knows. He's acquainted with the deepest griefs that you go through. Now, let me say this as well. Grief, many times, is relocated or assigned to the loss of someone, which that's the majority of time we face grief. However, grief is not only assigned to that. You may lose a friendship. You may lose a marriage. You may lose a child. You may have lost a child. You may have had a dream and, man, God, I knew God was going to do this and he's going to work this, and it doesn't work out in your favor, and you begin to grieve the idea that you're not going to be able to accomplish something. Now, there are different stages of grief and how serious they are. But when we talk about grief, we're not just solely talking about when you lose someone. We're talking about anything that you've lost or you wish you had, and you go into this sadness that you can't explain, and you try to fix it. So back in 2020, in June, it was right after COVID had started, my in-laws, John and Dorothy, were in a home of one of our friends, an Alzheimer's facility that one of our friends owned. And when COVID started, they wouldn't let anybody in. I don't need to tell you what that does to a daughter. I mean, it's like, this is a lot. So we would do what we call window visits. We'd go over there and we'd stand outside the window. They had dementia and Alzheimer's. They didn't know if we were a raccoon or a bluebird. I mean, they didn't. But when Sue stood in the window, they knew her for some reason. Weird, isn't it, how that works? And she was able to kind of see them. Well, June of that year, 2020, we got a call and Sue's dad passed away. And so we all went over as a family, and it was a good time, honestly, of beginning of the healing. Although our grieving had already started, when you have somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia, they're really not there anyway. So you start grieving their loss before they're gone. And so in 2021, at the early part of it, it was COVID still, and Sue looked at me and she said, "Hey, I want to bring my mom home to the house," because she couldn't see her. They would not let her in. She couldn't see her. And so I said, "Sure, yeah. Well, when can we go get her?" I'm like, "Right now? You want to go get her right now? Let's get the keys." And that's what we did. I got the trailer hooked up. We drove over there and put her 90-year-old mother in the car and drove her to our home. And we thought, well, we'll just take the risk. We'll take the risk, whatever that is, because we wanted to have some quality of time and life with her mom. We brought her into our home, and her mom actually passed away in our home. And Sue was there by her bedside every single day, taking care of her in her grief. Like, that's how it works. So here's what I want to do. Baby, where are you at? Come on up here. So you have to talk to the experts. You got to hear from the experts, right? So I thought, my wife, she's pretty good at this. She's been through it a couple times. So I asked her two questions. Number one, I asked her two questions that I would like her to answer, okay? And you only have 3 to 5 minutes.
All right.
Okay.
I'll try to stick to my notes. Okay, the first thing that came to my mind when JP asked me to share about grief was obviously my mom and dad. That was the first thing that came to my mind. It's something, when you grieve a parent, it's very deep. But I was sitting there, I was actually thinking to myself, okay, there's a lot more than just grieving a parent. And grief is loss, is really what it comes down to. You may have lost a child, you may have lost a job, you may have lost your marriage, or maybe even, I was thinking, like, he kind of stole some of the stuff I was going to say.
You stole it from me.
I think I told him and he used it.
No.
But the reality is that loss is so many different things. And, you know, maybe it's the loss of a life you thought you would have, or a loss of relationship, you know, like with a friend. But, okay, where am I at here?
Put your glasses on, baby.
Okay. So one of the things that I am learning, I shouldn't say I have learned it, because I feel like it's something you continue to learn. So we grew up near the ocean. And I feel like God has like shown me how grief, going through mourning, is like riding that wave. So when you grow up near the ocean, the first thing you learn is that you never turn your back on a wave. You never turn your back on the water. It's different than a lake. And so if you turn your back on the wave, it's going to knock you down. If you try to stop the wave, it's also going to knock you down. So grieving and mourning is like riding that wave. It's going to come and it's going to go. But if you don't allow yourself to go through it, and then I'm just saying, when I'm learning, when there's thoughts of my parents come up, and sadness or occasionally regret, not a ton of them, but if I don't allow myself to feel it and go through it and mourn it, it's just going to knock me right over. And it's okay to, God's reminding me it's okay to feel that. One of the things God used to help me deal with this was before my parents even passed away. It was a 45-minute drive to Reflections, where my parents lived. And so mourning not the loss of their life at that time, but mourning the Alzheimer's that they were dealing with was huge too. And so God used that drive. I would sit for that hour, and really honestly, it was time to just think and pray and feel and absorb what was happening in my life and what was happening in my parents' life. And I really believe God used that to also prepare me. And the thing that I always cling to, and I'm very thankful for, is Matthew 5:4, that says, "Blessed are those that mourn, for God will comfort you." And I've really seen that to be true in so many different ways. A lot of the times, the comfort comes from the tiniest little thing that some people call it, what do you call it, a God wink or something? But it's like a small little thing, but like there's little things that happened, and I just know God allowed that little thing on purpose just to comfort me. And so I'm thankful for that. So that's my story.
Thanks, baby. Maybe I took a few of her points, just a few. That's not that many. You know, grief is different for everyone. You can't, we shouldn't, although we shouldn't, look at people that are going through grief, and even though we don't understand why they can't get over it, you have to remember it's different for everyone. It's not the same. As many people as are in this room, all of us will handle it differently. We just do. And we need to be gracious with one another when we get stuck. Because we do get stuck in grief. We get stuck. You know, grief is a composition. Grief and mourning actually have been closely said like they're synonyms, like they're the same. Grief and mourning are not the same. Grief is actually the internal feelings that you're feeling. Mourning is how you express it externally. So when the Jews were grieving over their sin, they would express it externally by sackcloth and ashes. That's mourning. They were in mourning. And so there's two different parts of that. What you see on the outside is just a glimpse of what might be going on the inside when somebody's dealing with grief. And it's just the mourning is the inward expressions turned outward, right? And so it's been said that there's 5 stages, right, to grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, just so you know, if you're going through grief, which I know there's quite a few in here that are, if you're going through grief, there is no right way to do it. You're just trying to figure it out, right? It's like you got to do each step to a certain specific degree. It doesn't work like that. They go in and out of one another. You get angry, and then you're in denial, and then you kind of accept it, but then you feel like you want to sleep for a week. You get depressed, right? And so this happens, and you go in and out, and as you're bobbing around in the waves that Sue was talking about, these things happen, right? And next thing you know, you get your wind, and you try to stand up, and you forget to keep your eyes on the wave, and it knocks you over. Then you get angry again, and the process starts over because you remember things, or things remind you of those people or situations that you've lost. You're going to experience things like this. By the way, Jesus grieved a lot. The Apostle Paul grieved a lot. But you may have these feelings: anger. Why, God? Why did you allow that to happen? Blame. You might be confused. In denial. Chances are you might get irritable. It might happen. You definitely will feel lonely. You'll feel like nobody else is on the planet, just you. You feel like crawling into a hole and under a rock. You're confused. You can't concentrate. Many times you're just in disbelief that the person or the thing is not there any longer. You just can't believe it. It's so hard to come to grips with. You lose your appetite most of the time. Can't sleep, can't get to sleep, can't stay asleep. You're exhausted, worn out, and tired. I don't have to tell you that with grief, one of the major outward ways of mourning we see is excessive crying. You might be grieving so much, and you've cried so much that you don't think you have any more tears in the pond. And then that one thing happens, and all of a sudden another pond shows up, right? And you start to cry again, and you think you don't have anything left. And you do. You become restless many times, and you don't know what the future looks like. Grief can bring a feeling of no hope. It can. You feel lonely. I've lost what I've loved. Even if you argued with them when they were alive. I can remember my dad. You guys know my story, right? Man, there were things, right? And we had to get it straight. But when he passed, I still grieve the loss of my dad. Even though he did things to me and said things to me that hurt me at times, he was still my dad, right? He's still your mom. He's still your dad. And you grieve. And we try to make sense of something that was put on us that we didn't ask for. Grief doesn't come, unfortunately, in an orderly time frame. It usually takes you by surprise. It usually takes us by surprise. And just when everything you think has been stolen from you, you have no breaths, You have no other emotions that you can feel. This big wave comes and smacks you down again. And you're like, what in the world is going on? How can I get some relief from this? As I said earlier, grief doesn't ever go away. How you deal with it changes over time. And how it can change is dependent on how you choose and what you choose to look at. If you don't stand around and watch the waves at the ocean, they will take you out. And grief will do the same thing to you. It will take you out. Take your breath away. I don't know if you've ever body surfed before. I don't recommend it because it's just painful sometimes. You catch this wave and you ride the wave in, right? And man, that was cool. And you kind of lose your breath and you stand up and think you have some relief. And then the fifth wave that was generating a quarter mile out, you think you're getting your breath, just like anxiety, grief that we're talking about. Just like, okay, I think today, I think I can do it. And you get knocked over. And you're like, what's going on? How can I do this? To run from grief, and this all relates to our one verse. To run from grief is to run from the very thing that can ease the pain of the loss. Many times what people do when they lose someone, they try to ignore it. They try to pretend it didn't happen. They fill their lives with so many things that they can't think about anything else. And I'm not saying there's balance in all of that. But that won't take it away. And if I can echo what Sue said, you have to let yourself feel it. It's okay to feel it. Some of you guys, if you're my age, and maybe a little bit younger, when we're growing up, I don't know if you grew up in this kind of home. I did. I remember my dad saying this, and something would happen to me, and I would start to cry. And my dad would say, JP, big boys don't cry. So we learn over time how to deal with stuff, right? Hey, don't cry, Well, I've learned since then, that doesn't work, okay? It's okay for big boys to cry. It's actually healthy, really, to show how you're feeling and the grief that you're experiencing and the loss and the pain. It's okay. Why? Because that's part of the journey for you and for us. Sometimes we try to resist the demands that grief puts on us. And I would say to you here this morning, if you're grieving, if you've been grieving, don't resist what grief can do in a positive way for you. I know it sounds weird. Grief, positive? Yes. Only if, you ready? Here's the catch. You invite Jesus into it with you. Try to do it on your own. Go ahead. Try. Doesn't work. You're not going anywhere. Grieving is a process God uses to bring us to a place of wholeness and rest. Only if we invite Him into the process with us and we rest in Him. Is it going to go away? I haven't talked to anyone to date that I've met with that's grieving that says, oh, it's gone. It just is not there anymore. I've yet to talk to anybody like that. Now, they tell me how God is working in them to change how they deal with things. But it is a process that God uses to lead us to wholeness. In Matthew chapter 11, 28, I'm going to read it again. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." The weariness is, in the original word, means grief. If you are grieving, would be a better word there. All of you who are grieving and you're carrying a heavy burden, I'll give you rest. Sue mentioned a verse, Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, and this verse, Matthew 11:28, it's actually a continuation of the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And then he says this, "Come to me, all of you who are weary." They're actually the same words. "And carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." But let me read it to you this way, because I think this will help. It helped me. There's two things that are found in this verse. The one is the invitation. And the invitation is this: come to me, and I will give you rest. That's the invitation. It's not a command, like, don't be anxious. That's a command. This is an invitation, choice. Come to me. You have a choice. You can come to me in your grief. You can come to me, and I will actually give you rest. As I was reading and thinking about grief and how sometimes even in grief we feel like we messed it up. I didn't grieve the right way, and that is not true. If that's going through your mind, don't believe that lie. Don't you believe that lie. God will always accept you if you come to him, no matter how you go about this. That's just who he is. He says in John chapter 6, verse 37, "However, those the Father has given me, if they will come to me, I will never reject them." In your grief, and if you're angry, well, I can't go to God because I'm angry. No. He already knows you're angry. He invites you to come to him so he can enter into that and help you process it and help get your mind straight. Well, I have to do this, and this. Well, no, wait a minute. That's what the Pharisees were doing to the Jews that caused them so much grief. No. Grieving is a process that's different for everybody. Jesus knows that. He's acquainted with the deepest griefs. Hey, if you just come to me, I'm not going to cast you out. I'm not going to push you away. I'm going to enter into that thing with you. And I'm going to walk through you. You know what he didn't say in here? I'll take it away. He didn't say that. I was reading this. I'm like, wait. The verse says, "Come to me and I will give you rest." It doesn't say, "Come to me and I will take all your grief away." Isn't that weird how he did that? He actually uses the things that we struggle with, the grief, as a tool to make us whole and for us to invite him in, if you accept the invitation of that. Hey, come to me. Come to me. I know you're grieving. I know you're sad. Come to me. The second part of this verse is this. There are subjects of the invitation. There's the invitation, and then there's subjects of the invitation. Who is he talking about? All of you in this room. I know there's some, quite a few actually, in this room who are grieving. All of you who are grieving and carry a heavy burden. That's who he's talking to. He's talking to you and I, right? Struggling with the loss of a parent, mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter. Struggling. Jesus says to you, come to me. Just come to me. Come to me. Come to me. Just come over here. Sit up on my lap. Talk to me about it. Let me give you some rest. I'm not going to take it away, but I'm going to give you rest in it. Now, here's what we want, right? Jesus will take away everything. That is not true. And it's not true in this case. But he does use things to draw us to himself, right? Even in our hurt, our pain, our loss, the tears, the anger, the fear, the frustration, Jesus says to me and you, right? He says to us, Hey, just come to me. That's who he's referring to here. Interestingly enough, the Apostle Paul grieved a lot, and he grieved a lot over the churches that he had been entrusted to him. He was in prison in Colossians. In the first chapter, he was on house arrest for 2 years, and he was grieving the state and everything he had to go through. He was grieving the fact, number one, if you're in jail, chances are you're going to grieve a little bit. Why am I here? Man, this really stinks. And you're losing something. It's a loss, so you grieve, right? Paul did this. He was grieving because he couldn't do what he wanted, and he was put in jail, and he could do nothing about it. Listen to Paul's words about what's been put on him and the struggle, because grief is a struggle. It's work. When you've cried all day long, you're exhausted. And your eyes look like a beanbag chair, you know, and there's nothing left. That's exhausting. Let's read Paul here, Colossians chapter 1. That's why I work and struggle so hard. By the way, that word struggle is the same word in Matthew that relates to grief. Listen. Jesus says, come to me, invite me in. Paul says this, and I depend on Christ's mighty power that works within me. Is he going to take it away? No. Is he going to quell the pain? Perhaps. But what he wants you to do in it is depend on him. That's what he wants from me and you. I just don't know if I can do it. Perfect. That's the perfect place to be. Perfect. I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. I'm going to invite him into this thing with me. Sue mentioned this verse, God blesses those who mourn, for they will be comforted. It doesn't say again, and I looked, I'm like, is there anywhere where Jesus says, well, I'll just take it away? It's not in the Bible. Doesn't exist. He does say, though, if you mourn, I will comfort you. If you're mourning, you're expressing your grief outwardly and you're struggling, you need to know that Jesus will comfort you if you let him. It's an invitation. Come on to me. Sit on my lap. Talk to me. Allow me to dry your tears. Here's the hope. One day, there'll be no more tears. There'll be no more crying. He'll wipe those tears from our eyes, and we get to see those loved ones again. The pain, the sorrow, the loss will not exist in heaven. That's your hope and my hope. Our hope here, invite Jesus in. Let him help you. Let him take that stuff. Does that mean it's going to be just easy from now on? I'm not going to lie to you. No, it's not. It's not. God doesn't say, poof, okay, fine, you're not grieving anymore. God uses sometimes the hardest losses to draw us to himself in the pain, because we have nowhere else to turn, although we try. We try all kinds of stuff. I'll just take up golf. I'll just buy 2 new trucks. Maybe I'll buy a 4th house. I mean, a boat. That's what I need, a sailboat. That'll make me forget everything. No, it will drain the money out of your bank account. That's what it will do. Like, we try all these things and we forget that Jesus says to us, hey, come on up here. Let me give you some rest for your soul. You know, after a long, hard day of work, you know, if you're working outside and you're exhausted, and you're just exhausted and tired, and you sit down for the first time, you know that feeling? You go inside and you're like, and if you're like me, you're like, you know, and I kick my shoes off, and I'm just like, Do you know that Jesus can give you that same feeling in your grief? That doesn't mean you don't have to go to work tomorrow. It just means that he's going to give you some relief and rest. But it's an invitation. You have to invite him in. I'm going to start preaching without my shoes on. That's comfortable. Okay. I was doing some reading, to close, I was doing some reading in one of my favorite, the Prince of Preachers, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Some of you young folks may not know who that is. He said this, I've learned in my grief to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock. I've learned to kiss the wave. Remember that wave that knocks you over? I've learned to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock. And the rock he is referring to is the capital R-O-C-K. The Rock of Ages. The Rock. He's your rock. Even when you're weary, even when you're confused, even when you're angry. And if we can get to a point where we can trust him enough to look and face that wave and say, I know it's coming, but I got Jesus right next to my side, and that wave cannot knock me over. It's possible. Let me read it to you one time, and then we'll close. Jesus calls to us and says this, come to me. Why don't you come to me? All of you who are weary and grieving, and you're carrying these heavy burdens. You know, I'll give you rest. I will give you some rest. My prayer is for us, for those of you who are grieving in here. I know you're here. I'm looking at some of you. I know what you're going through. I get it. But Jesus gets it way more than I do. You need to invite him in, even in your pain and anger and fear and frustration and confusion. Will he take it all away? No. But he will use it to make you whole and to push you into a deeper relationship with him. My prayer is for you to be able to do that, for us to be able to do that with one another. If someone you know is going through one word to say to you, exercise grace. Exercise grace with each other. Don't get over. Why? I just don't understand why they can't get over it. You know, those are the people you just want to walk up and say, oh, yeah, just, be gracious to each other. Those of you guys know that there are people in our fellowship that are grieving. Grace. And sometimes grace is silent and just comforting.